أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر ولله الحمد.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversations about Beauty and Islamic Theology. Now, today it is our absolute pleasure to have Professor Trevor Marchand. Professor Trevor Marchand is Emeritus Professor of Social Anthropology at the School of Oriental and African Studies. His PhD in Social Anthropology, completed at SOAS in 1999, was grounded in ethnographic and historical data collected during a 13-month apprenticeship with minaret builders in Sana'a. That study resulted in first monograph, Minaret Building and Apprenticeship in Yemen, published in 2001. In that same year, Professor Marchand resumed fieldwork in West Africa, this time laboring and apprenticing with a team of mud brick masons in Jen, Mali, which led to a second monograph, documentaries and exhibitions. Adding further strings to his vocational bow, Professor Marchand also carried out fieldwork over a 2-year period at the Building Crafts College in Stratford, East London, earning him a City and Guilds diploma in fine woodwork. Professor Marchand's ongoing research with craftspeople aims to expand popular definitions of knowledge and promote greater appreciation for skilled work. Professor Marchand, welcome.
Thank you, Bilal. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
It's a pleasure to have you. Professor, one of the key goals of this project is to really explore the intersections between theology, religion, and the production of things beautiful or material culture. And your work really stands at the center of this disciplinary vesica, because not only do you write about the production of material culture, but you also actively participate in that process yourself, which really allows you to taste the aches and frustrations of the apprentice and also understand the different meanings that people attribute to process and production. So perhaps I can start by asking you what led you to this particular approach to the study of making and the production of things beautiful.
Sure, thanks, Bilal. Just before I start off, please call me Trevor, not Professor. It makes me feel very old, or as old as I actually am. So no, Trevor would be nice. Well, I started off as an architect, and I had always wanted to be an architect since I was a child. I enjoy building things. In fact, when I finish this interview with you, it's a nice sunny day today, and I'm going to continue a construction that I'm making up in my back property in my orchard. So I'm still building and working with wood. But when I was an architect, I was fortunate. I had an opportunity to see a few of my designs built. And so I would go regularly to the building sites. I would oversee the construction and just make sure that things were going according to my drawn plans. And what I became really interested in is the way that the tradespeople were communicating and learning on site, you know, as a community. And a lot of it was being done without any spoken language. It was kind of a watch and imitate or a look and mimic type process. There was a hierarchy there. Certain people on the job site were recognized for having certain kinds of skills and expertise, and others were recognized clearly as learners. And it was that whole human dimension, I suppose. It spoke about something really universal, about the way that we learn things as humans, the way that we learn to use our hands to create things. And so that took me to anthropology. In order to investigate those questions. I had already done some field work before going officially into anthropology. I did some field work in West Africa, in northern Nigeria. And so I wanted to do more of that. Northern Nigeria was simply no longer secure. It wasn't a secure place to go back to and carry out fieldwork. So I went to Yemen, which is a place that I had backpacked through in younger years. It is the most beautiful country and such tragic situation now, unspeakable. But I went to Yemen, and I was hoping to work with a team of laborers there to learn the apprenticeship system firsthand. there was a minaret that was being built on a very historic mosque just down the road from where I was staying at first. And I never dreamt of working on a minaret site. I didn't think that as a foreigner and a non-Muslim that I would be permitted to work on a religious building. But I used to go every morning to watch these guys. It was like going to entertainment every day, to the theater, watching them up on the top of this tower, laying bricks without scaffolding, without any secure structure around it. And I used to just sit on the curb and watch them in the morning before trailing off looking for another building site that might take me on. And finally, they were suspicious of me and they said, "What are you doing here?" And I explained to them that I had come to Yemen to study builders, come up to the top of the minaret. So I followed them up to the top, and they invited me to work with them. And I started the next morning, and I ended up working with them as a laborer for a year. And it was an absolutely phenomenal opportunity to work on what is now a landmark in Sana'a.
Wow.
A city. So that's how I got into it. And then I, as you mentioned in your introduction, I carried on those studies to do comparative studies between different kinds of apprenticeships to understand what was universal about the way we learn as humans, and also what's culturally and socially specific. And so I went to work in other sites.
And what, there's a number of ways that you could have studied this particular process. One is this kind of detached art historian, perhaps, or just an observer, but you decided to actually become an apprentice yourself. What kinds of insights do you think that afforded you, becoming an apprentice?
Bilal, that's a great question, actually. And in anthropology, traditionally, there were kind of two strains. There were those who were kind of lumped into the camp of universalists and those who were relativists. And at their extreme ends, the universalists believed that at the end of the day, we're all essentially the same. We might speak different languages. We might have kind of a veneer of different cultural values or social practices, but essentially we're all the same. And the relativists, the extreme relativists, if you push relativity, cultural and social relativity to the extreme, we are so different because of the contexts in which we were born and educated and grew up in, that it's almost irreconcilable to a certain extent. I fall somewhere in between and probably more on the universalist camp. And I've discovered that, working and traveling all over the world, that in fact, we can really share often a deep sense of humor with people in completely different cultures and in different languages, but we also share similarities in the way that we learn things, in the way that we express things, and that we express our knowledge. And so I felt that it was really important for me to also draw upon my own learning experiences as a laborer and apprentice on these building sites, not just to observe what the other young men were going through, but to kind of go through it as a team member. And so, in a sense, feel it at another dimension and reflect critically on that. And the questions that I would ask myself about how I was learning or why I was meeting a certain challenge and having difficulty with it, I could check in with the guys that I was working with and, compare notes. And so I think in a way it gave me a richer understanding. And just to add to that, one of the other reasons is because I like to be active. And so one of the great pleasures of being there was investing my own energy in making things, as a team member with these communities of builders. I derived a great satisfaction from that. It kept me pleasurably busy. And it was a nice way to pass field work.
And did you find that, one of the things that is very common to many forms of the transmission of knowledge in the Muslim world is the cultivation of the self, the cultivation of character, the importance of adab. Did you find that this was something that was emphasized, or did you yourself feel some kind of personal transformation? Not in the kind of glamorous Hollywood way where you found nirvana, but And because you've worked in so many different contexts in Yemen, in Mali, and in England recently, do you find that there's a different emphasis on this formation of character in the different contexts?
Great question. I'm going to refer back to what I mentioned before about kind of, universalism versus relativism and find the mix between. One thing that I think binds all craft people, that at least the ones that I've encountered around the world, binds them together is that a deep-seated component in their education, in their formation, in their training is discipline and patience. In Yemen, they used to say, al-sabr jamil. Patience is beautiful. And in fact, I mean, it was really interesting. Patience was emphasized too on the building site in Jenne in Mali. And it was very much emphasized in the building crafts college where I studied with the carpenters. And in fact, that's what almost all of the woodworkers that I interviewed, when I had asked them, what are the key qualities that are required to be a successful woodworker? Almost to the person, they would include patience in the list of things. And some of them would really emphasize patience. So patience, discipline were at the root. So that was part of the person's formation. And, on any of the sites that I've worked on, it's not just the usta or the master's ability to master their trade, but also a mastery over the education of the young men on site, and in the case of the building crafts college, young women who are training there, harnessing their energy in a gentle but firm way, really kind of inculcating this sense of not just self-discipline, but also self-critique. Learning to kind of measure what's good within oneself. Mm. I mean, you could almost, if you wanted to connected to an Islamic context, you could almost say the inner jihad, to check oneself that one is doing the right thing, that one is really kind of doing something to your fullest capacity. And in the Yemen context, something that I noted while I was working on this site was that there was an interesting correlation, or what I thought was an interesting correlation, between the training on the building site with religious education and the kind of the stages that one reaches in one's kind of spiritual development as a Muslim, you could say, as a member of any religious community, really. And so you will be familiar with these, but these steps of, Islam, to kind of, to submit and to discipline one's body, to perform ablutions properly, to pray properly, to perform the rituals correctly. And that often has to be kind of, instilled in young children from kind of, in Yemen, it was about 7 years old that they started with. Fathers would start with their boys at that age. And it was the same thing on the building site. It was the young apprentices. These were young guys, and they were mostly coming from rural villages. So they had left their families behind. They had minimal or no education. And so their formation almost passed from the hands of their parents and from seniors in the villages where they grew up in the countryside to the masters that they were now employed by, these master builders. And so their formation was dependent on them, and it was about kind of disciplining them and getting them to behave in the correct manner when clients would come around, when suppliers would come, to behave in a correct manner that was fitting of a craftsperson, but also fitting of somebody who happened to be building buildings on religious sites, building minarets. And also, for instance, during Ramadan, we did not work during the daytime in Ramadan. And the masters would, one of them in particular, would stop to do particularly his midday prayers. So there were these examples that were being set for the younger men, and they didn't always understand what they were doing, either on why they were given a certain task and they had to perform it, in the same way that a young child might not understand why they're performing certain bodily rituals in becoming Muslim. So that next stage after that was, I compared it to Iman, to developing an understanding of one's immersion in this context. And I would say the same thing was happening on the building site. One became kind of a senior laborer, or might have graduated to the position of apprentice. We could come back to that later because that was a slippery category in Yemen. But when they became an apprentice, they were expected to start developing an understanding of those actions and tasks that they had been disciplined to perform. In the same sense that, as a student kind of grows and as they go through furud, or religious education, they gain a deeper sense of why they're doing what they're doing. And then ultimately, there's the notion of ihsan, and from hasana, to make beautiful. But it's about making one's spirit beautiful. It's about imbuing one's total intentionality with doing good, with making beautiful. And I would say that that was really embodied in the activities of the masters. These guys weren't using architectural drawings. They weren't engineers. They had no formal training. They had learned to make things beautiful, to arrive at certain proportions and achieve certain geometries through this long training, whereby they understood very deeply what would make a beautiful minaret in relation to its urban context. And even that beauty wasn't just in what they made. The master mason on the building site even embodied it in his gestures. And it was very interesting because when he was dealing with just us as laborers, he could be harsh. And he wasn't always so graceful in everything that he said to us. But when the clients were around, or when senior men from the neighborhood would come by and visit and that sort of thing, he behaved in the most gracious manner. And he had taken on that kind of a baraka of behavior, a gracefulness, a blessing of behavior. So, anyways, that's a long answer to your question, but I think that probably comes across most strongly in Yemen. And it was a particularly, don't want to say it wasn't a spiritual context, because not all of the young men would have considered themselves to be terribly religious, and neither the Masons either. But Islam was a more dominant component within the kind of the cultural and social framework. Above the doorway, for instance, to the entrance of the minaret, because these buildings were built from the inside out. As I said earlier on, there was no scaffolding. So you didn't build a scaffolding and build the building from the outside in. Rather, you build it from the inside out. As the spiral staircase went up in relation to the central column, so did the exterior walls. So the staircase served as the vehicle for bringing both laborers and materials to the top as it got higher and higher. And so it was a dangerous building site, really. But they felt that they were protected by God, and they had a massive brass insignia above the doorway to the minaret that read, MashaAllah, what God wills. And this protected the builders on a daily basis. In Jenne, another Islamic context, the builders also performed benedictions. The Masons performed benedictions each day. And it often began with Bismillah, and then a MashaAllah, and then a lot of secret knowledge that was blended into there. If you want, we could talk about that. But it was to bless the site, to make sure that the building stood and that nobody was injured. And I'm pleased to say that in all the building that I've done, I've never been on a site where anybody was seriously injured. The worst that happened was, I think somebody broke a big toe when he dropped a brick on it.
Oh gosh, no, I shouldn't laugh.
Well, he can. That's another that was another event that addresses, I think, your interests in Islamic context. The Mason produced a blessing and a medicine, poured it over the injured boy's toe, and he was back to work within
Wow.
half an hour. So anyways,
Wow.
but sorry, I'm going on. Please ask the next question.
No, thank you. I mean, it's really fascinating because it appears that it forms a kind of contrast with the more institutionalized forms of practice in the Islamic guilds, in the pre-modern Islamic guilds, where it's very clear from the beginning that this is almost like a Sufi sheikh kind of relationship between the master and the students, and there's a very clear set of codes everyone has to do the prescribed rituals and the prayers. But it seems here that, of course, it's intimately tied to Islamic forms of knowledge, but it seems like Islamic forms of knowledge have developed some kind of sensibility that this practice taps into, but sometimes not in sometimes in a clear way, like you describe the rituals, and sometimes it's just in the air and people are kind of responding intuitively.
That's an excellent summary of the situation. And I think what you just mentioned about the Sufi type framework that kind of shapes and forms other craft practices in the Near and Middle East, that was quite absent in Yemen. It fascinated me that there was no official guild. And in fact, I don't know of any artisan that was a member of a guild, and there was no formalized guild of masons. So right away, that kind of, the idea of the Sufi chain, where you're connected through lineage to, generations of masters, it didn't exist, surprisingly. And so therefore it was much looser. Groups of builders, or I should say individual masons, they knew each other, but they practiced in a much more autonomous way than they might in other contexts. And there was absolutely no expectation that the laborers all had to pray together. I mean, to be quite honest, the ritual that was most faithfully followed on the building site was the cut chew in the afternoon.
Right.
But just to contrast it with Mali, sorry, just to say too, I'm sorry, I'm going back. In Yemen, it's expected that there are Sufi, or there were, I should say were, I don't know what the situation is now, but that there were Sufi brotherhoods or something similar, but that they were in the north of Yemen, they were more underground. So it wasn't something that you would find in the open. In West Africa, the Sufism and brotherhoods and the Qadariya, other institutions, they're part of the historic context there. And in Jenne, there was a very, very strong association of Masons. Masons are Bade, and they had an association called a Badeton, which is the equivalent of a guild, where the members would all meet together. They paid dues into kind of a fund to help those who were sick or injured, to help young ones get married, etc. But also to arrive at political and economic decisions. What is our wage, and what do we need to, kind of set a wage at, kind of like a union. Also, if there was a big project to do, such as replastering the mosque in Jenne every year, the whole organization happened around the meetings at the Badeton. If there was a big public project, the dishing out of contracts, who was going to get to work on it, was agreed in the Badeton. And that sort of thing was absent in Yemen. So there was some interesting contrasts in the organization, which filtered all the way down to social relations on the building sites. They were very different in the two places.
And was there some kind of conceptualization of the master as being anything other than like a person who's a master of a technical form of knowledge, or did people have any kind of rituals around the master, or any kind of idea that this person is a possessor of a spiritual or knowledge or some kind of charisma. In fact, did you ever encounter this idea of the kind of ustad or?
Yeah, again, really interesting differences between the two contexts, between Yemen and Mali. In Yemen, all of the men that I worked with were Zaidis. So they were Shia Zaidis, but as you're probably familiar with, Zaidis are, in many of their social and religious practices, they're actually quite close to Sunnis. I mean, and the two populations have historically got on fairly well together. Times are different, but in that context, there was quite an orthodox, quote unquote, following of religious principles. So even if people did privately practice, and I have no evidence of it, but even if they privately did practice other kinds of perhaps nonconformist rituals for protection, or this was never spoken about. Almost like everything was always kind of in the name of God. What was differentiated was, in terms of knowledge, was that there's a concept of aql, reason. It was expected that everybody who worked on the building site, whether you were a laborer or you were the ustad, the master, that you possessed aql, that you possessed reason. To say mafish aql, the person has no reason, is the same as saying that they're majnoon, that they're crazy. So there was a strong sense that everybody had reason, and then the master he was recognized more to have a sense, rather than ilm, which is kind of almost like a technical knowledge, a knowledge that's associated with, say, a certain kind of discipline, like the ilm of an engineer or of an architect or of a sociologist. They were recognized more to have ma'arifa, which might be related more to kind of it's a personal knowledge, and more to a kind of an embodied knowledge. It's a knowledge that is expressed in the doing rather than in any kind of deep theory. So it's a personalized kind of knowledge. The hierarchy was there. So, you had everything from the shagi, who was the laborer, and then there was a whole bunch of different stages in between, up to the usta. So, but it was all very much based on that kind of that technical know-how, knowing how to build and design. So one progressed through the different stages based on kind of a seniority of expertise, experience, and working alongside the masters. In the Jenne context, in Mali, it was quite different, because there were laborers and there were apprentices, and the apprentices had more of a fixed contract. Their position was more secure. And then there were the masters, the bare boumou, the master masons. And in the learning process in Jenne, once you were an apprentice, it was expected that not only were you learning the skills of the trade, but that you were also learning to perform benedictions. And those are the benedictions to which I referred earlier. It's the benedictions that are used to protect the site on a daily basis, to protect the building, to make sure that it's a safe abode for those who will live there, to bring plenty. And two things went into, there were two ingredients in this, in making these benedictions, or gara, or albarka, more typical Arabic word. One was bai bibi, and the other one was bai kore. These are two different kinds of knowledge. so the Baibibi translates literally to almost black skin knowledge, the knowledge of the indigenous African knowledge, which was a knowledge of almost of the plants and the trees, medicinal knowledge, knowledge of how to make amulets, or grigri, as they're often referred to there. And these things were buried in the foundations of buildings. They may have been put into walls to bring safety to the site and to the building. But Baibibi was often mixed in incantations and verses with what was called Baikore, which was a knowledge based on the Quranic scriptures. So Islamic text in particular, written text, was part and parcel of creating these amulets that had protective powers. So it was, in a way, it was really a kind of a practical approach to the environment, the harsh, really difficult environment in which they found themselves. Extreme temperatures, extreme aridity, frequent periods of drought. It wasn't, you use every option available to you. So you use your religious knowledge for protection, but you also use the knowledge in the environment itself to try to put the environment on your side of things, if that makes any sense. So a master builder was expected to have knowledge of both, not just, in fact, I've written before that the stability of a building was as dependent on the secret knowledge that went into preparing the mortar as the mortar itself.
Wow.
So two quite, and this was, this was openly done. This borrowing and mixing, this syncretic, very practical syncretic approach to bringing security to yourself and to making buildings.
It's fascinating because it really speaks of this kind of non-Cartesian approach, especially this idea of the secrets, this non-Cartesian approach between the mason and the building, right? The two are intimately tied together, which is so foreign to our, I guess in modern architecture, when you've got the superstar architects, it's even better if they have some kind of moral turpitude because it adds more glamour to the final structure. But it seems to be the opposite case in Mali. That's really interesting.
Absolutely. These guys in Mali, Bilal, I have to emphasize what gentlemen they were. And, really to a man. I mean, and there were approximately, it was estimated that there were some 200 masons working in and around Djenné. And all of them were most gracious. Although they did have they had often interesting disputes with one another where what they called albida, which is kind of a secret knowledge which can be used in perhaps more dangerous or destructive ways. So if a mason expected that another mason was trying to steal his work, they would cast spells on one another. So you could make benedictions, but you could also turn it the other way. So you had the knowledge of both. But in most cases, these were men who conducted themselves with absolute grace, and they served as role models, as exemplars for the young men who worked with them. May I just add, because I know that the Islamic context is particularly interesting for you. Again, this is in Mali. So I mentioned before in Yemen that most of the laborers and apprentices were coming from the rural countryside because city kids didn't want to do that kind of work. So they were being kind of imported in as labor. In Djenné, in Mali, it was similar. Most of the laborers on the site were not from Djenné itself, but they were young men who had come to Djenné to study the Quran. So they were talibé, as they called them. Talibé, those who study religion, or the local word for them was also garibu. And Garibu means little stranger. But the Garibu were little strangers because they were boys who came from often poor villages. They would come to Jenne to get their religious education. They would live with marabouts, religious scholars, and they would learn to recite their Quran after many years staying with them. But they needed to support themselves. So they would hire out their labor to the master masons. And so they were typically the workforce. So interestingly, the laborers themselves were undergoing a religious training in parallel with their training on the building site. And so the whole context, in a sense, became framed by that. Anyways, that was just to add that.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for adding that, because that really illuminates the perspective of the Masons, and also brings some interesting correlations, I think, with some of the other craft traditions that we find across the Islamic world. As a final question, Trevor, you spoke about the kind of the beauty of character of these particular individuals, and also the beauty of ethics. You mentioned this great phrase that patience is beauty, which we also find in the kind of woodworking context. And I was wondering if you could just speak to us a little bit about some of the aesthetic values that you came across in Mali or in Yemen. What makes a beautiful minaret, or what makes a beautiful mud structure?
That is a really, truly excellent question, and it is one that I have pondered for years. So, as I said to you early on, I was trained as an architect, and I've always been interested in aesthetics and the idea, the power of symmetry, the idea of proportions. What gives a structure kind of a pleasing form? And what is the relation between structure and form? I'll start with Yemen, where I first, I'm going to go back earlier, because this was probably the beginning of kind of the dangling question mark that still hangs over my head, is how is beauty achieved in these contexts? In northern Nigeria, the first field work that I did, the masons in Zaria, the master masons, were competent at building not only very, very beautiful and sturdy mud buildings, rectilinearly planned, often with domed ceilings inside, constructed using palm timbers and mud bricks. But one of the most fascinating things is that they would cover the public facade of what was called the zaware, which is it's kind of these extended family compounds have an entry building, and that's controlled. It's a male space. It's where the household head operates his business from and meets his friends. And then the rest of the extended family compound is huge, with lots of different buildings depending on the number of family members living there. And the zaware is the public building. And on the facades of these buildings, particularly of elite families, the masons would create these incredible patterns in sculpted mud, of these geometrical designs. They called them dagi, which are in fact knots, Hausa knots or northern knots. A lot of them actually have magical connotations. They would place them above windows and doors to protect the building against jinn or evil spirits from entering into the compound. But what was fascinating was they would start in an area on the facade, and they're big geometrical forms, and there's often kind of no two that are repeated on the facade of a building, and they're all interlinked. And they would end up covering the entire facade, so that it was evenly covered. All of the design was very balanced and proportional, and aesthetically dazzling. And it was remarkable. I mean, you can have trouble doing that on a piece of paper with a pen if you're going to cover it in design. You know, I'm thinking like a William Morris design. The beauty of it is the way that he was able to cover a certain area with repetitive patterns in a pleasing way. The way that they did this without any drawn plans, without any template, without sketching it out first on the facade, but simply starting off with the mud plaster and molding it over the exterior. So if you ever get an opportunity, Bilal, to take a look at some of the traditional architecture in Zaria or Kano or Katsina, any of the Hausa Emirates, it's absolutely stunning, and it would speak volumes to your interest in aesthetics. So and this really made me curious. When I went to Yemen, again, they were building these minarets without any drawn plans. And they're made up of kind of three parts, the minarets, because they're freestanding structures. There's kind of a square high base, like a pedestal. And then on top of that is the minaret, which is kind of more or less round in plan, but actually it's composed of multiple sides, always multiples of 4. So it might start off as sitting on top of its 4 base. It might start off as kind of an octagon in plan, 8-sided, then working up to 16, sometimes 32 facets all the way around. And then the dome, the most beautiful domes were what they called muthalaja domes, these ribbed domes that would sit on top. Always, again, the ribs were multiples of 4 in their total number. But they achieved all of this without any drawn plans. Of course, it was the long experience that they had, but they also talked about an aesthetic judgment. The master builder would say that the minaret is complete when it fills my eye.
Wow. How does that, what's the term? Do you remember the term in? Because that's a fact. Are they're using the term ayn, I guess, for?
Yes, for eye.
Eye. That's fascinating.
I can't remember the exact phrase. I will send it to you. And they would say, when it fills my eye. And they would make, the master that I worked with would make this gesture.
Mm.
The first minaret that I built with them, for instance, they had a certain amount of money from the patron. The people who patronize, this is perhaps interesting to fill in the context. The people who paid for the building of these freestanding minarets, often to accompany existing historic mosques. So it was a religious endowment. They called it sadaqah, to make, religious, to make a benevolent endowment. And these were often industrialists or people who had made a lot of money. So in a way, it was kind of earning your good points by having these buildings built. And the first minaret that I was working on, the budget was fixed at a certain price, and the masons had started to build, and they judged that the base should be a certain height, and so they built it to that height, and they started to build the minaret tower. And they were running out of money and realized that they would have to cap it with a dome. And they said that it would look like a hadba, a hunchback old woman.
Okay.
If we stopped it there, it would not be pleasing.
Mm.
And so they said that if they had to, I think this speaks also volumes to kind of the ihsan, the beauty of their intentionality. They said that if the client or the patron wouldn't pay for the additional height that they judged would be needed to give it the proportions to fill the eye, in other words, the right vertical proportions, that they would swallow the cost of themselves.
Wow.
And it turned out that the patron agreed that they could build it higher. Occasionally, from time to time, each of their minarets was finished on the exterior with a distinct pattern of brickwork. And these were always geometries of brickwork in relief that covered the exterior. And this was determined, the patterns were determined by the master mason on the site. And he would say, if you asked him, how did you come up with the pattern for this one? He would say, It came to me when I was chewing cud. Students too, I mean, when they were studying for their exams, the best way to focus on your studies was to chew cud. And so it was an enlightenment, because it puts you in didn't put me in a relaxed mood, it made me jittery, but it puts you in apparently a relaxed, more open-minded. And they would sketch things every once in a while with pencils, and they would just draw little patterns. But then they would come to the site and they would just start laying them out. They would tell the muwakis, the stone carver, to carve bricks of a certain size and carve certain geometries. And the master mason would start off, because they were building it, course by course of brickwork, and would get higher and higher. And he had in his mind what bricks he needed to arrive at a certain pattern of diamonds and geometries, and would start laying it out. And the other masons would follow behind him, laying the bricks, usually, interestingly, in clockwise formation. And they would continue with the tower, and out would come this geometry. So it was really difficult for me to try to get any handle on how these aesthetics were planned. Rather, I had to accept that, unlike my experience as an architect, where you draft things over and over again on paper to come up with some kind of pleasing proportion, or you use formulas and the golden ratio and whatever to come up with a pleasing building. A pleasing building was something that the aesthetics were kind of a hard-earned expertise with years and years of experience. And there was, again, the idea of beauty, which I think in a Western context, we judge as something almost ethereal. Beauty is something theoretical. You achieve it through kind of an intellectual contemplation. In that context, achieving the aesthetics was part and parcel of achieving the form and structure. It was all part of the same thing, and it was embodied, and you knew how to do it, grounded in that experience. And again, I'll be very brief here. In Jenne, it was very much the same thing. There was it's both cities, Sana'a and Jenne, are both UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So there's quite a strong building code there about what you can and cannot do. But in Jenne, the Masons also took pride in reproducing the traditional architecture, but every once in a while introducing some innovation, either in the structure or something new in the decorative vocabulary, usually small changes. But they simply kind of built on the tradition. You will know this from calligraphy. The strength of it is not being innovative and the crazy kind of one-off superstar artist or whatever. It's actually the mastery is mastering the tradition that has come before you. And there's a pride in that. And once you've mastered that tradition, once you can replicate beautifully what has existed before, then you have license and confidence to just make small alterations or to improvise when you need to make an improvisation.
That's a really interesting idea, because it's no once you understand tradition in this way, and once you've mastered tradition, it doesn't seem to be innovation in the modern sense, but rather an updating or perhaps a refining. That's the kind of mentality, I guess.
A refining, and I think instead of referring to architecture, if I was to refer to the world of furniture making, timber furniture making, those who do reproduction furniture today are seen as kind of second-class craftspeople. They're not part of the avant-garde set of designer makers who each have their signature style. So, to reproduce Chippendale or Hepplewhite or whatever, to reproduce these old masters, it's recognized as being skillful, but at the end of the day, it's not seen as artistic or innovative. So, to make it as kind of a superstar designer maker today, you put your identity into the things that you make. And that's where, that's where it lies. It lies in the objects you've produced. In the context of Sana'a and Jenne, at least with the Masons that I worked with, it was about the things that you made, but it was also about kind of an interior creation. There was a real pride in the mastery that came with being able to reproduce a tradition, to be part of the chain. And if you could, it's interesting, Bilal, in Jenne, if a Mason, a young Mason in particular, did produce some kind of improvisation because, the timbers that were available were much shorter than they had been in the past. So he had to make a ceiling over a room, and say an existing room, and he had to rebuild the ceiling, and he had to improvise a new ceiling pattern. They were always kind of laid out in geometries. He'd have to improvise a new ceiling pattern because the context restricted what he could do. He could only get palm timbers of a certain length, or the mud that they were getting was only of a certain quality. So they were producing decorations in a particular way. They would never claim that they had made that innovation. Rather, it was something that it was almost always attributed to a dead master. Oh, that's what so-and-so used to do. So there was a kind of humility that went along with, everybody would know that particular Mason had produced this improvisation or even innovation. But it was considered bad form to take full credit for that. It was passed along the chain. It was somebody else's master who taught them how to do that.
Wow.
So I think there's an interesting contrast to be made there between the mastery in that context and becoming seen as kind of a master furniture maker, designer maker in the contemporary context in, say, England, for instance, or in architecture.
Well, that's absolutely, Dr. Trevor, I could talk to you for hours about this stuff because everything you're saying, there's so many parallels that are flying through my head. But I just wanted to thank you for two things. One is for joining us and for your wisdom and your insight and your perspectives. And the other thing is on a personal level, because about a decade ago, I had finished my master's and I desperately wanted to be a calligrapher. I knew it was the thing I wanted to do. But I also had this, after 4 years in academia, I thought, okay, well, I also want to carry on. And so two of my friends who are now lecturers in the anthropology department at UCL, Dr. Ashraf Haq and Dr. Igor Kerstich, both of them are SOAS graduates.
I know them both, yes.
Oh, you know them both. They recommended your book to me. And they said, well, why don't you read this book? And it was Minaret Builders of Yemen. And then I read the book and I thought, oh, I don't know who this guy Trevor is, but that's what I want to do. I can do both, right? And so that's what I did. I did my PhD about apprenticeship in calligraphy, and then I got to do it. So I wanted to, this interview for me is like a real honor because it's kind of full circle where I can now speak to you about your work and to give my personal thanks. So I just wanted to say thank you so much.
Thanks, Bilal. And it was a real pleasure doing this interview. I mean, before you pressed record, I learned what your background was and your interest in calligraphy. So I have to say that it was a particular pleasure speaking with you about this work that I had done in the past, because I feel like you understand it in a really deep way. And you have to promise me that, please send me anything that you've published from your PhD. I'd be very interested in reading it. And secondly, I hope that we will have an opportunity to get together and chat again. And this time, or next time, I'm going to ask some questions because I want to find out about the work that you did.
It would be my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Say hi to all of those who we know in common.
Oh, I will do. Absolutely. Thank you so much.